what migration was really like for hadrosaur herds across ancient lands. Picture a herd so vast it stretched from horizon to horizon, 10,000 duck-billed dinosaurs moving as one living tide across a continent. This wasn't chaos. This was a migration so precisely orchestrated that every juvenile traveled at the center, every adult on the perimeter, and every step followed routes memorized by matriarchs who had walked them for decades. They covered 25 kilometers a day, crossed rivers thick with predators, and endured months of polar darkness to reach the ancient forests of Alaska and back again. This was the largest sustained migration in Earth's history, and it happened every single year for millions of years. The wildebeest of the Cretaceous weren't just survivors. They were masters of a journey that still shapes the world today. These were the Edmontosaurus, a type of hadrosaur that grew up to 40 feet long, weighed as much as 4 tons, and possessed a duck-like bill packed with over 1,000 teeth designed for grinding through the toughest Cretaceous vegetation. But what made them remarkable wasn't just their size. It was their movement. For decades, paleontologists debated whether these creatures actually migrated or simply wandered. The bone beds told one story: mass graves containing thousands of individuals, stacked in layers that suggested they returned to the same river crossings year after year. The trackways told another: fossilized footprints stretching across more than 1,000 kilometers of ancient floodplain, pressed into stone by herds so large they would have taken hours to pass a single point. And then there were the teeth, silently recording seasonal climate shifts in their oxygen isotopes, like a prehistoric GPS locked in enamel. What emerges from the evidence is something almost impossible to comprehend. Every late summer, as the polar forests of ancient Alaska began their descent into months of near-total darkness, the herds assembled. Not randomly. They organized by age, by experience, by a social structure so sophisticated it mirrors what we see today in modern elephants and caribou. The matriarchs, individuals who had survived 20 or more migrations, led the way south across a continent split by a vast inland sea. Behind them stretched a column of life so immense that the dust raised by their passage would have been visible for days afterward. So how did they do it? How did a 4-ton herbivore without a map, without language, without anything but instinct and memory, navigate a journey of potentially thousands of kilometers through predator-filled territory, with 20% of its calves never reaching the destination? And how do we know any of this from rocks that have been silent for 66 million years? The answer lies buried in the trackways, locked in the isotopes, and preserved in the bones of those who didn't make it. This is what migration was really like for the herds that ruled the Cretaceous. And it begins in a place that, for months at a time, never saw the sun. The northernmost edge of the Cretaceous world, what we now call Alaska's North Slope, was already surrendering to twilight when the herd began to stir. Overhead, a sky that had been pale and endless for months was deepening into bruised purples and charcoal grays. The sun, a stranger that once refused to set, now barely scraped the horizon before retreating. It was late August, 69 million years ago, and winter was coming for the polar forest. The air still carried the scent of damp conifers and crushed ferns, but something had shifted. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves from ancient metasequoias, their feathery needles already stiff with the first crystalline frosts that only the oldest members of the herd had felt before. Flowering plants that had bloomed in continuous summer light now shriveled and dropped their seeds, while the cycads and ginkgos that lined the riverbanks turned brittle and pale. Food was vanishing, and the herd knew it at a level deeper than thought. This was Prince Creek, a floodplain 70 degrees north of the equator, a place that shouldn't have supported creatures of such immensity. Yet here they were, thousands of them, Edmontosaurus of every size, from 6-ton elders whose hides were crosshatched with scars older than some members of the herd, to yearlings barely tall enough to brush their mother's underbelly. They had spent the summer dispersed across the coastal plain, gorging on the endless vegetation that exploded under the midnight sun. Now they were gathering, drawn together by an invisible signal that rippled through the scattered groups like electricity through water. The migration was assembling itself. If you could have stood on a low rise and looked out across that ancient landscape, you would have seen something no human eyes have ever witnessed. Not a herd in the modern sense, but a living geography. A slow flood of muscle and bone pouring across the fern prairies from every direction, converging on a route so ancient it had worn shallow grooves into the bedrock over countless generations. The dust kicked up by their passage hung in the cold air, a haze visible for tens of kilometers, and, at the center of it all, the matriarchs were already positioning themselves at the front. These were not random leaders. The oldest females, some having survived 30 migrations or more, carried in their brains a map built from experience, not instinct. They remembered the safe fords, the predator ambush points, the shallow lakes where the herd could drink after 3 days of dust. They recognized landmarks that had not existed when they were young and others that had been there since before the inland sea split the continent. Scientists now believe that hadrosaur lifespans could reach into their 40s or 50s, and that these matriarchs formed the core of the herd's collective memory. Bone beds containing individuals of widely varying ages, from hatchlings to geriatrics, buried together in the same riverbank sediments, tell us this was a multi-generational society. The grandmothers led because they had survived the learning curve. A calf born that spring knew nothing of this. It had spent its first months surrounded by its cohort, a band of young animals that moved together like a single fidgeting organism, but always ringed by the legs of older siblings and aunts. Hadrosaur trackways from Colorado to Alaska show this pattern repeatedly. Small footprints clustered in the center of the trail, medium-sized ones circling them, and the enormous basin-shaped prints of the adults forming the outer perimeter. The herd organized itself automatically, a living fortress with the most vulnerable at its heart. A 12-meter albertosaur could pick off a stray yearling in seconds, but it would never breach that wall of 3-ton adults without risking a shattered leg or a tail club to the skull. So the calves stayed in the center, and the center kept moving. Communication held it all together. The elaborate nasal chambers of Edmontosaurus were not just for breathing. They were resonance chambers capable of producing sounds that ranged from deep infrasonic rumbles that traveled through the ground to sharper calls that cut through the chaos of hooves and coughing dust. In the Badlands of Alberta, paleontologists have reconstructed the hollow crests and looping airways of related hadrosaurs and determined they could produce distinct calls that might have functioned like names or group signals. When a mother lost sight of her calf in the dust cloud, she could broadcast a frequency that cut through the noise and received an answering squeal within seconds. The herd was a web of sound, each individual a node in a network that extended for kilometers. Breaking that web meant death. But let's return to that late August twilight. The signal to depart had not been given yet. The matriarchs were still standing at the edge of the gathering, heads raised, sampling the wind. What were they waiting for? A certain temperature threshold? A celestial cue we can no longer detect? Or something else entirely? Something as simple as the moment when the last edible patch of horsetails turned fibrous and bitter. We do not know. What we do know is that when the moment came, it came for everyone simultaneously. Across the plain, the scattered bands stopped grazing, oriented themselves southward, and began to walk. The route they followed was a highway paved by geology, the Western Interior Seaway, a shallow sea that split North America from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, had created a broad coastal plain running north to south, along the eastern front of the newly forming Rocky Mountains. This flat, well-watered corridor was the migratory lifeline for millions of animals. Fossilized trackways, stretching across more than 1,000 kilometers, trace this exact path, with Edmontosaurus footprints found at sites from the North Slope down through Alberta and beyond. The dinosaurs walked this land not because it was easy, but because it was the only way. To the east lay the sea, to the west the rising peaks. The plain was their road, and they had been using it for 10 million years. The pace, once established, was relentless, 25 kilometers per day. That number comes not from guesswork, but from biomechanical calculations based on limb proportions, estimated muscle mass, and the spacing of fossilized footprints. At that speed, a journey from northern Alaska to the warmer plains of what is now Montana and Alberta would have taken 2 to 3 months. The herd did not sprint. It powered forward with the efficient, ground-eating stride of animals designed for distance. Every third day, they stopped near water. Bone chemistry from tooth enamel shows periodic shifts in oxygen isotopes consistent with regular hydration, stops at bodies of water where the local rainfall signature differed from the dry plains. The herd would drink, rest for a few hours, and then continue into the night if the moon was bright. But the horror of the migration was etched into its casualty rate. Modern wildebeest migrations lose roughly 20% of their calves each year to drowning, predators, and exhaustion. The hadrosaurs were no different. At every river crossing, the bones tell the story. Mass death assemblages at old ford sites contain the remains of juveniles, their bones crushed and trampled, their carcasses scavenged by crocodilians and small theropods before the mud could bury them. A young Edmontosaurus that survived its first migration had beaten odds that stacked ever higher the farther south the herd traveled. Predation was constant but shaped by opportunity. A lone adult had almost nothing to fear from the tyrannosaurs that stalked the plain. Albertosaurus and its smaller cousins were ambush predators, not pursuit hunters. They lacked the stamina to chase the herd over open ground. But they had learned to wait. At narrow passes, at blind bends in the trail, behind the dense stands of conifers that lined the ancient riverbanks, they positioned themselves downwind and motionless. The herd could smell them, only when it was too late. An unlucky yearling that strayed to the edge would feel the rush of air, hear the boom of a footfall, and then nothing. The herd walked on. It had to. Stopping to mourn was not a luxury the migration afforded. By the second week of the journey, the landscape had transformed. The stunted polar forests of Alaska, with their gnarled conifers and low-growing ferns, gave way to open parklands dotted with broadleaf trees and expansive fern prairies. The temperature climbed, slowly but perceptibly. The herd shed the extra layer of insulating fat they had accumulated over the summer. The matriarchs navigated by a combination of celestial cues and the memory of previous years. Hadrosaur brains, reconstructed from endocasts, show enlarged olfactory bulbs and well-developed optic lobes suited for both scent tracking and visual landmark recognition. They followed the coastal plain like a road, never straying far from the western shore of the inland sea, where the air was moist and the vegetation green. And then came the river. It began as a distant smell, a coolness in the air that cut through the dust. The calves, thirsty and tired, pushed forward, only to be checked by the adults. The matriarch at the front had stopped. Her head swung slowly from side to side, the great duck-like bill testing the breeze. Ahead, a wide, muddy river snaked across the plain, its surface dappled with the shadows of passing clouds. It looked calm. It was not calm. Beneath the brown water, 15-meter Deinosuchus, giant crocodilians that had haunted Cretaceous rivers for 50 million years, drifted with only their eyes and nostrils breaking the surface. On the far bank, in the shadow of the trees, a pair of Albertosaurus stood motionless, watching the herd's approach with the patience of animals that had eaten well the week before and could wait another day. This was the crossing point, a place the herd had used for generations. The bones of those who had failed here were already part of the riverbed, ground into pebbles by the current. The matriarch remembered. The water was higher than last season, the current faster. A late summer storm in the mountains had sent meltwater surging down the tributaries. The river was death. She knew it. But behind her, the polar darkness was advancing, and every hour spent waiting was an hour the calves would need later. She lifted her head, and the herd fell silent. The rumble that followed was not a sound you heard so much as felt, a vibration that started in her chest and traveled through the ground into the feet of every animal behind her. It meant one thing: we move, now. And so, with a hesitation that lasted only a heartbeat, the great migration stepped forward into the water, into what waited below. The first hoof to break the surface sent concentric rings shivering across the water, rings that vanished within seconds, swallowed by the current. The matriarch at the front was already chest-deep, her massive body a breakwater against the flow. Behind her, a column of animals stretched back onto the plain, a living bridge of flesh and bone that would take hours to cross. The river did not care. Under the turbid surface, primitive brains registered the vibrations, translated them into hunger, and began to move. Deinosuchus, the terror crocodile of the Cretaceous, was built for exactly this moment. Its eyes, raised on bony knobs, broke the surface with barely a ripple. Its jaws, long enough to crush a hadrosaur's leg, with a single bite, opened slowly, tasting the mud-churned water for the chemical signature of approaching prey. It had waited at this crossing for a week, conserving energy, its metabolism slow enough to last months without food. The hervestrium was a buffet it had learned to anticipate, and now the first course was walking directly toward its snout. The calf was a yearling, just large enough to have survived its first winter, but still small enough to be separated from the adults by the press of the current. Its mother was 3 body lengths ahead, struggling against the deepening water, her attention fixed on the far bank, where the lead matriarch was already climbing onto the gravel shore. The calf slipped. A submerged root, ancient and slick with algae, caught its hind foot, and for one terrible moment its body tilted sideways, the brown water closing over its back. It thrashed, instinct overriding any memory of what to do. The motion sent a pressure wave directly into the sensory pits lining the Deinosuchus's lower jaw. The attack was not traumatic. There was no thrashing, no prolonged struggle. The crocodilian lunged upward with a speed that belied its bulk, its jaws closing around the calf's midsection with the sound of splintering wood. The water erupted pink. The calf's panicked vocalization, a high-frequency distress call that should have summoned its mother, was cut off before it could form. The Deinosuchus rolled, a death spiral designed to dismember, and the calf vanished beneath the surface, leaving nothing but a spreading stain and a series of bubbles that popped soundlessly in the current. By the time the mother turned, the water was empty. She called, a deep resonant sound that traveled through the river, through the ground, through the bodies of the herd still pushing forward behind her. No answer came. She called again. Nothing. The column did not stop. The herd could not stop. The pressure from thousands of bodies behind her was an unstoppable force, and she was in its path. She stumbled forward, hooves finding purchase on the far slope, and climbed out of the river with mud streaming from her flanks. Her calf was gone. The migration continued. This was not cruelty. This was physiology. Edmontosaurus lacked the brain structures for complex grief. Their limbic systems, reconstructed from endocasts of related species, were oriented toward immediate survival, not prolonged mourning. But they remembered. The mother would avoid this crossing point next season. She would pass that avoidance to her subsequent calves through learning that looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from trauma. The herd's collective memory incorporated loss as automatically as it incorporated the location of water. The crossing took 5 hours. By the time the last stragglers climbed the far bank, the river had claimed 17 calves, 2 elderly adults whose legs had simply given way, and an unlucky adolescent that had wandered too close to a fallen log that wasn't a log. The crocodilians, gorged and sluggish, sank into the deeper channels to digest. The tyrannosaurs, on the far bank, denied their ambush by the sheer chaos of the crossing, melted back into the tree line. They would try again tomorrow. They always tried again tomorrow. The herd reformed on the southern shore, a process that took another hour. The matriarchs walked the perimeter of the gathering, their heads low, their nasal chambers producing soft infrasonic calls that served as a roll call for the surviving members. Each band answered in turn. The yearling cohort was lighter by 11%. The adults had lost 2 of their oldest members, veterans of migrations past, whose knowledge of alternate routes and hidden water sources was now gone forever. The herd was diminished, but it was still a herd. It was still the largest concentration of animal biomass on the Cretaceous coastal plain. And now, with the river behind them, the true architecture of the migration became visible. The herd did not move as a single amorphous blob. It was segmented. At the front, the oldest matriarchs, their pace steady and unhurried, their heads turning in synchrony every few minutes to check the position of the sun. Behind them, a kilometer-wide column of prime-aged adults, the strongest walkers, the ones who would break trail through thick vegetation and test the stability of ground ahead. Inside this column, in a protected corridor that shifted constantly to keep the weakest at its center, moved the juveniles, not randomly grouped, but arranged by age cohort. The youngest calves, those born that spring, clustered near the front where the matriarchs could monitor them directly. The yearlings, big enough to keep up but still too small to defend themselves, occupied the middle. The subadults, gangly and awkward, brought up the rear of the protected zone, already practicing the dominance displays and threat postures they would need as adults. This age segregation was not conjecture. Fossilized trackways from the Mesa Verde group in Colorado, from the Prince Creek Formation in Alaska, and from dozens of sites in between, preserved not just individual footprints but entire herd configurations. The smallest tracks, some no larger than a human hand, consistently appear in distinct clusters, surrounded by medium-sized tracks, which in turn are ringed by the largest prints. The pattern repeats across thousands of kilometers and millions of years. It was not accidental. It was a social structure so successful it remained unchanged for the entire evolutionary history of Edmontosaurus. But there was another pattern in the trackways, one that paleontologists noticed only after mapping entire kilometers of continuous trail. Every so often, the herd would stop. The footprints would become chaotic, overlapping, as if the animals had milled about in confusion. And then, after a gap of several meters, the tracks would resume, but in a slightly different direction. Sometimes the new orientation would correct back to the original heading within a kilometer. Sometimes it would persist for days. What was happening in those gaps? The answer, when it came, transformed our understanding of Hadrosaur intelligence. The herd was navigating, not just following the coastline, not just moving south by instinct. They were making decisions. The matriarchs at the front would encounter an obstacle, a flooded river, a burned-out stretch of forest, the fresh spoor of a large tyrannosaur pack, and they would stop. The herd would consolidate, and then, after a period that might have lasted hours or even a day, they would set off in a new direction that bypassed the danger while still trending generally southward. Someone was choosing. But who? And how? The fossilized skull of a mature Edmontosaurus contains a brain case that, while not large relative to body size, shows significant development in regions associated with spatial memory and olfactory processing. The olfactory bulbs, in particular, were enormous, suggesting an ability to smell water, vegetation, and predators from distances modern herbivores cannot match. And the inner ear, with its semicircular canals, was exquisitely tuned to detect low-frequency sound vibrations traveling through the ground. A herd of hadrosaurs was not just a collection of individuals. It was a distributed sensor network, with the matriarchs acting as nodes that collected environmental data, and the herd's collective response functioning as a kind of decision-making algorithm. This is not fanciful speculation. Modern elephants, which occupy a similar ecological niche as megaherbivore travelers, exhibit precisely this behavior. Elephant matriarchs remember distant waterholes from decades earlier. They navigate using infrasound that travels through the ground for kilometers. They make collective decisions about migration routes through a process that scientists struggle to distinguish from voting. And their brains, when compared to hadrosaur endocasts, show convergent evolution in the very regions that control memory and communication. The hadrosaurs were not lumbering reptiles waiting for extinction. They were sophisticated social animals that had solved the problem of long-distance migration millions of years before the first wildebeest took its first step. The days turned into weeks. The coastal plain, once lush with the late summer growth of horsetails and ferns, began to change. The vegetation, responding to the same seasonal shift that was driving the herd south, was going dormant. The edible plants were retreating toward their roots, their above-ground portions turning woody and indigestible. The herd's thousand-toothed batteries, capable of pulverizing the toughest Cretaceous vegetation, were now working harder for less nutrition. The animals was losing weight. The calves, still growing, needed more food than ever, but the forage was delivering less. The migration was no longer just a journey. It was a race against starvation, and it was, at this point, roughly 500 kilometers south of their starting point, that the herd encountered something entirely unexpected. A rival herd. The trackways show it. Two massive sets of parallel trails converging on the same river valley, merging first into a zone of overlapping footprints, then separating again, but not without leaving signs of chaos. Broken vegetation, scattered bones, the distinctive gouge marks of hadrosaur teeth on hadrosaur bone. Cannibalism. No, something else. Conflict. Two herds, each numbering in the thousands, had attempted to use the same migration corridor at the same time. The resource at stake was not territory. It was order. The coastal plain was wide enough for both, but the ancient highway, the well-trampled path that generations of matriarchs had memorized, was only so wide, and the lead matriarch of the second herd, younger and less experienced, had made a fatal error. She had tried to cut ahead. The resulting confrontation would have been visible from space if such a vantage had existed. Two walls of living animals, each fronted by the eldest and most dominant females, facing each other across a stretch of trampled ground. The vocalizations alone would have been deafening, deep resonant honks overlapping into a continuous thunder that could be felt kilometers away. The ground shook with the stamping of feet. The calves, sensing the tension, retreated as far into their protected corridors as they could go. And then, as these things usually do, it resolved with a gesture. The lead matriarch of the larger herd took a single step forward. Not a charge, just a step, deliberate and final. She lifted her head to its full height, 3 meters above the ground, and the hollow crests of her nasal passages caught the sunlight. To the rival matriarch, this display was a language older than words. It said, "I have survived more migrations than you have years. My herd outnumbers yours 3 to 1. Stand aside, or we will walk through you." And the younger matriarch, reading the aggression in the posture, the angle of the neck, the subtle flaring of the secondary crests that signaled dominance, made the calculation. She turned. She led her herd off the highway, onto a secondary route that wound through rougher terrain and would cost them days. The larger herd continued south without so much as a glance backward. Dominance had been established without a drop of blood spilled. But the bones we find near those convergence zones, the ones with healed fractures and tooth marks that match hadrosaur dental batteries, tell us that it did not always end so peacefully. Now, as the herd pushed deeper into the southern latitudes, the days grew shorter and the nights colder. The polar forest was a memory. The landscape here was open parkland, dotted with groves of broadleaf trees and intersected by rivers that ran brown with autumn sediment. The dinosaurs were now well into their third month of travel, and the signs of exhaustion were becoming impossible to ignore. The older adults were gaunt, their hip bones visible beneath thinning skin. The yearlings had stopped growing, their bodies diverting every available calorie to locomotion. Even the matriarchs, who had paced themselves for exactly this moment, were showing signs of wear. Their gait, once fluid, was now stiff. Their vocalizations were less frequent. They conserved energy where they could, because they knew what was coming. The final river. Not the most dangerous crossing, not the widest channel, but the most psychologically significant. This river marked the boundary between the northern and southern halves of the migration corridor, the point beyond which the climate became reliably milder, the vegetation more persistent through the winter months. It was also the most heavily hunted stretch of water on the entire route, because the predators, the tyrannosaurs and the crocodilians and the smaller dromaeosaurs, knew this river just as intimately as the herd did. They knew it was the last place the migration would be forced into the water before it reached the relative safety of the southern plains, and they had gathered accordingly. There are river-crossing bone beds in Wyoming and Montana that contain the remains of hundreds of juvenile Edmontosaurus, layered in a matrix of river sand and predator tooth marks. These are not natural accumulations. They are massacre sites. The pattern is always the same: the remains of the youngest and weakest at the bottom, then a layer of scavenger activity, then the bones of slightly older animals above them, indicating the crossing happened year after year, generation after generation, the riverbed slowly filling with the dead. Paleontologists working at these sites report a distinctive emotional response to the evidence. You can feel the fear in the rocks. You can trace the panic in the way the skeletons are positioned, their limbs tangled, their necks twisted back toward the shore they never reached. This was the price of the migration, and every year the herd paid it in full. But this year, something was different. The matriarch at the front, the same ancient female who had faced down the rival herd and tested the current at the first river, approached the water's edge and did not stop. She walked straight into the shallows, her head held high, her gait unbroken. Behind her, the herd hesitated. Something was wrong. The water was shallower than expected, the current slower than memory suggested. The matriarch was already halfway across, her body barely submerged to the knee, when the herd understood. The river had dropped. A drought upstream, far to the west in the rising mountains, had reduced the flow to a fraction of its normal volume. The crossing that should have been a bloodbath was, this year, nothing more than a wade. The crocodilians, stranded in shrinking pools, could only watch as the herd passed beyond their reach. The tyrannosaurs on the far bank, baffled, retreated without a kill. For the first time in months, the herd experienced something approaching safety. The calves splashed through ankle-deep water, their tails flicking with what looked like joy. The adults drank deeply, filling their guts with water that was not fouled by the bodies of the dead. And as the last of the column climbed the southern bank, a sound rose from the herd. Not a distress call, not a dominance signal. Something else, a sound that any zookeeper would recognize instantly. The deep, rhythmic, collective rumbling of a herd at rest. The migration had survived the gauntlet. Ahead lay the wintering grounds. Behind them, the polar darkness was already swallowing their birthplace. They had walked 2,000 kilometers. They had lost a fifth of their calves. They had crossed 6 major rivers and skirted 3 rival herds. And now, for the first time since the journey began, they could stop. But the story of the Edmontosaurus migration does not end with its arrival. It ends with a mystery. Because for all the trackways, all the bone beds, all the tooth isotopes and oxygen signatures, a growing number of scientists now believe that what I have just described to you, the epic continental trek, the 1,000-kilometer odyssey, may never have happened. Not like this. Not on this scale. And the evidence that contradicts the epic migration story is, in its own way, even more fascinating than the story itself. It is written not in the bones of the dead, but in the atoms of the living. And the more we learn from those atoms, the stranger and more wonderful the true picture becomes. To understand the case against the Great Migration, you have to shrink your perspective. From the vastness of the coastal plain, the sweeping trackways, the mass bone beds that seem to tell an epic story, to the microscopic level, inside a single tooth. Because there, embedded in the enamel, are atoms that can tell us, with shocking precision, where an individual animal spent its life. The technique is called strontium isotope analysis, and it is one of the most powerful tools in modern paleontology. Strontium is a trace element that leaches into groundwater from ancient rocks, and different geological formations have different isotopic signatures. When a plant absorbs water, it takes up the local strontium signature. When an animal eats that plant, the strontium becomes locked into its tooth enamel, where it remains unchanged for tens of millions of years. If you find a hadrosaur tooth in Alberta and analyze its strontium, it will tell you where that animal was eating when the tooth formed. If the strontium signature is local, the animal lived and died nearby. If the signature comes from rocks 500 kilometers away, the animal was a traveler. For decades, this tool was used on modern animals to track migration routes with remarkable accuracy. Then, in the early 2000s, paleontologists began applying it to dinosaurs. The results, when they finally came in for Edmontosaurus, were not what anyone expected. In 2020, a team led by David Evans and Thomas Cullen published a study in Biology Letters that analyzed strontium isotopes from hadrosaur teeth collected across western North America. They sampled individuals from Alberta, Montana, and the Dakotas, expecting to find isotopic signals that ranged widely across the continent. Instead, they found something else. Every specimen, regardless of where it had been discovered, showed a strontium signature consistent with local rocks. The animals had not moved far. According to the isotope data, the maximum range for most individuals was about 80 kilometers, roughly the distance between Dinosaur Provincial Park and the South Saskatchewan River. Not 2,600 kilometers, not even close. The epic migration, the great trek from Alaska to Mexico and back, the corridor of death and renewal that had captured the public imagination for decades, was suddenly in serious scientific doubt. And the strontium study was not alone. A separate line of evidence, published in 2012, had already cast doubt on the idea that Alaskan hadrosaurs migrated south for the winter. That study looked at bone histology, the microscopic structure of fossilized leg bones from Edmontosaurus specimens collected at the Prince Creek Formation. What the researchers found inside those bones was something that should have been impossible for a migrating animal. Bones are not static. They are living tissue that constantly remodels in response to the environment. In modern animals that live in highly seasonal climates, bones lay down growth rings much like trees. Rapid growth during the warm, well-fed summer creates a zone of spongy, highly vascular bone. Slower growth during the cold, hungry winter creates a dense band of compact bone. If the Alaskan hadrosaurs had migrated south each winter to escape the polar darkness, their bones should have shown continuous summer-style growth all year round. They would have been eating abundant vegetation in the southern plains while their northern birthplace was buried in ice and shadow. There would be no pause, no winter slowdown, no ring of deprivation locked in their bones. But that is not what the scientists found. The bones from Prince Creek showed exactly the pattern of an animal that stays put through brutal winters. Clear, sharp rings of arrested growth, followed by bands of renewed bone formation when spring returned. The animals were not fleeing the cold. They were enduring it. Their bodies were slowing down, conserving energy, waiting out the months of darkness just like a modern moose or musk ox. And at the end of that long polar night, they were cranking their metabolisms back up and growing again. Year after year, generation after generation. One particular detail from the bone study is especially haunting. The blood vessel channels in the bone, tiny tunnels that supply nutrients to growing tissue, showed cyclical changes in density that correlated with the seasons. During the summer, the channels were large and numerous, feeding a surge of growth. During the winter, they constricted. The bone itself was adapting to the cold, shutting down blood flow to its outer layers to preserve heat, exactly like a modern mammal that overwinters in place. This was not a lizard basking in the sun. This was a warm-blooded, or nearly warm-blooded, animal that had evolved physiological strategies for coping with a polar climate. And so the narrative curdles. The story of the wildebeest of the Cretaceous, the heroic multi-thousand-kilometer odyssey, the matriarchs leading their herds across a continent, begins to look like a mirage. A beautiful, compelling mirage, built on genuine but misread evidence. The trackways, so convincing in their scale, may not record one epic journey, but the accumulated local movements of many animals over many lifetimes. The bone beds at river crossings may not be sites of annual massacre on a migratory route, but simply places where local populations, trapped by flood or drought, died in large numbers over millennia. The pattern of age segregation in the herds, still real and still remarkable, may have been an adaptation for surviving in place, not for marching across a continent. But here is where it gets even bigger. Because if the hadrosaurs did not migrate, if they spent their entire lives within an 80-kilometer radius of the Arctic Circle, then they accomplished something far more astonishing than a long walk. They thrived in conditions that would kill a modern elephant or a crocodile within weeks. They raised their calves in darkness. They found food on a frozen landscape where plants stopped growing for 4 months of the year. They maintained complex social structures, multi-generational herds, and collective decision-making without the easy option of fleeing south. They were not running from the winter. They were defeating it. And this realization forced paleontologists to ask a question that cut to the heart of dinosaur biology. How did they do it? What was inside an Edmontosaurus that allowed it to survive where other reptiles would have simply frozen to death? The first part of the answer came from the bones themselves. The bone histology showed not just winter slowdown, but the capacity for rapid metabolic acceleration in the spring. This is a hallmark of endothermy, or warm-bloodedness, the ability to generate internal body heat and maintain a constant temperature, regardless of the outside cold. For decades, the debate over whether dinosaurs were warm-blooded had centered on creatures like the small, active theropods that gave rise to birds. But now, a giant, lumbering, duck-billed herbivore was providing some of the strongest evidence yet. Edmontosaurus was not a cold-blooded reptile dragging itself from sunpatch to sunpatch. It was a furnace. The second clue came from the nasal chambers, those elaborate hollow crests that hadrosaurs used to produce their deep, resonant calls were not just for communication. They were heat exchangers. When a hadrosaur exhaled in the freezing polar air, the moisture in its breath would have condensed and frozen instantly if the nasal passages had been simple tubes. This would have led to rapid dehydration and respiratory damage. Instead, the complex looping architecture of the nasal passages allowed the animal to warm incoming air and recapture moisture from outgoing breath. It was essentially a biological countercurrent heat exchange system, similar to the complex nasal structures of modern reindeer and snow monkeys. The hadrosaur's face was an adaptation for cold. And then there was the body mass. An adult Edmontosaurus weighed several tons. That much mass retains heat with remarkable efficiency. Even with a relatively low metabolic rate by mammal standards, a large hadrosaur could have maintained its core body temperature through the winter simply by being enormous. The juveniles, smaller and more vulnerable, would have relied on the thermal blanket of the herd, huddling in the protected center where the combined body heat of thousands of adults raised the ambient temperature by several degrees. The creche system was not just defense against predators. It was a survival strategy against the cold. So, if the Alaskan hadrosaurs were year-round residents, What about the fossil trackways that stretched for over 1,000 kilometers? How do you explain those? The answer, when it emerged, was both simpler and more elegant than the migration hypothesis. The trackways were not the record of a single herd on a single journey. They were the product of a meta-population. Many different groups, each living in its own territory, each following short seasonal loops of 100 kilometers or so between the lush coastal plain in the summer and the forested uplands in the winter. Over millions of years, the cumulative effect of all these local movements, preserved in sediment layers that stacked one upon another, created the illusion of a single continental highway. The trail was real, but it was walked not by one herd over one season, but by countless generations of countless herds, each taking its own small, vital steps. This reframing did not diminish the hadrosaurs. It elevated them. They were not slaves to instinct, compelled to march blindly toward the sun. They were flexible, adaptable, capable of reading their local environment and responding to it in sophisticated ways. Different populations in different latitudes almost certainly behaved differently. Those near the Arctic Circle might have stayed put, relying on fat reserves and social huddling. Those farther south, in the more temperate latitudes, might have made longer seasonal journeys, tracking the rains and the new growth. And those living along the shores of the retreating inland sea might have shifted their ranges in response to the advancing and receding coastline. There was no single migration. There were many migrations, a mosaic of movement strategies that varied by region, by climate, and by need. But the debate is not over. Not by a long stretch, because there is another line of evidence, one that has only recently become accessible, that threatens to upend everything all over again. And it comes not from the bones of the dead, but from the chemistry of the living soil itself. The strontium study that seemed to disprove long-distance migration had a critical limitation. It could only tell you where an animal was eating during the period when its tooth enamel was forming, which, for a hadrosaur, was only a few months of its juvenile life. A dinosaur that migrated as an adult might still show a local strontium signature from its youth. The study couldn't track the animal's entire life history. It was a snapshot, not a movie. Other chemical techniques, such as oxygen isotope analysis, have produced conflicting results. Some oxygen isotope profiles from hadrosaur teeth do show seasonal variation consistent with moving between regions with different rainfall patterns. Others do not. The data is maddeningly inconsistent. Every time a new method is applied, it seems to tell a slightly different story. And that is the state of the science right now. We have trackways that scream migration. We have isotopes that whisper residence. We have bones that hint at cold tolerance and bones that hint at seasonal movement. We have a creature that was clearly capable of traveling long distances, but may not always have needed to. The hadrosaurs keep their secrets, locked in stone and atom, and they do not give them up easily. But there is one final piece of the puzzle, one last layer of evidence that has begun to emerge from a place no one thought to look, and it might finally tip the balance. Because it turns out that the hadrosaurs were not just leaving traces in the ground, they were leaving traces in the sky. And the trail they left behind is bigger than any footprint, older than any bone, and written in a language we are only just learning to read. The trail was dust, uncountable tons of it, lifted from the floodplains by millions of hooves, suspended in the Cretaceous atmosphere, drifting on winds that carried it across the inland sea and deposited it in places no hadrosaur ever walked. And in those deposits, layer upon layer of ancient lake sediment, a team of geochemists found something extraordinary. A signal, a repeating pulse of microscopic bone fragments, fossilized pollen from trampled plants, and distinctive chemical signatures that could only have come from the digestive tracts of giant herbivores. The pulses appeared at regular intervals, corresponding to spring and autumn. They were strongest where multiple trackway systems converged, and they stretched across a swath of North America from northern Montana all the way to the Colorado Plateau. The hadrosaurs were not just walking across a continent. They were seasonally pulsing across it in waves of movement that left a signature in the very atmosphere. To understand what this means, you have to think about scale on a level that strains human comprehension. Modern dust storms, the kind that lift topsoil from the Sahara and fertilize the Amazon rainforest, involve roughly 180 million tons of dust per year. That's an enormous number, but it's spread across the entire Sahara, a desert nearly the size of the United States. Now imagine concentrating a significant fraction of that dust generation into strips of land only a few hundred kilometers wide, generated not by empty wind over barren dunes, but by the sustained impact of millions of hooves, day after day, week after week, month after month. The Cretaceous coastal plain was not a desert. It was a humid, well-vegetated corridor. But when hadrosaurs walked across it in numbers that would blacken the horizon, they pulverized the soil crust, tore up plants by the roots, and exposed fine silt to the wind. The dust they raised would have been visible from orbit as a persistent haze hugging the eastern front of the Rockies, a banner of the herd's passage painted across half a continent. And it is in the lake beds of ancient Utah that this dust reveals its secrets. There, in a formation known as the Green River Shale, researchers drilling sediment cores found alternating layers of dark organic-rich clay and lighter silt. The silt layers contain something unexpected, tiny fragments of bone, most less than a millimeter across, mixed with pollen from plants that do not grow near lakes, plants that thrive only on well-drained upland soils, the very plants the hadrosaurs would have been eating. The sorting of the grains, the size distribution, and the sharp, unworn edges of the bone fragments all pointed to a single source: wind-blown dust from a dry, trampled landscape, not waterborne sediment from a river. The dust had arrived on the wind, and it arrived at the same time every year. The timing is the key. The lake sediments also contain layers of algae that bloomed in summer and died in winter, creating annual laminae, like tree rings. By counting these laminae and analyzing the chemistry of the silt layers sandwiched between them, scientists could pinpoint the season of deposition with astonishing precision. The dust arrived in pulses, a sharp spike in early spring, and a broader, longer pulse in late autumn. Spring, when herds would be moving from winter refuges to summer feeding grounds, their hooves churning the thawing soil. Autumn, when they would be returning, the ground already dry from the summer heat, vegetation reduced to stubble, the dust clouds rising higher and traveling farther. The pattern matches exactly what you would expect from a large-scale seasonal migration. Not a continuous roam, not a sedentary population, but a mass movement that happened at the same time, in the same directions, year after year after year. But here is the crucial detail that reconciles the two sides of the debate. The dust signature was not uniform across the continent. In the northernmost sites corresponding to the ancient high Arctic of Alaska, the dust pulses were weak. The sediment cores from the ancient lakes of the North Slope show a different pattern, one that suggests the ground was trampled heavily in summer, but not in winter. The hadrosaurs were there, but they were not raising great clouds of dust in the cold months. They were hunkered down, moving little, their hooves leaving marks in mud and snow, but not generating the kind of atmospheric signal that reaches lake beds 1,000 kilometers away. In the south, near the Colorado-Utah border, the dust pulses were strong and clear. The herds were moving across dry, exposed ground during their spring and autumn passages, and in the middle latitudes, in what is now Wyoming and Montana, the dust signal was year-round. The herds were resident. They moved, but in shorter loops, never generating the massive seasonal plumes of their migratory cousins. The picture that emerges is not a single migration corridor, but a gradient of movement strategies, each adapted to local conditions. Think of it not as a highway, but as a circulatory system. In the far north, The heart of the Hadrosaur world beat slowly, the herds staying local but gathering in enormous numbers during the brief summer to exploit the explosive plant growth. In the temperate middle, the heart beat steadily, the herds moving in regular circuits, like caribou on the tundra, always within reach of water and forage. And in the transitional zone between north and south, the heart surged, the herds coalescing into the great seasonal pulses that left the dust signature in the lake beds, moving hundreds of kilometers, perhaps 1,000, but not crossing the entire continent. They were not wildebeest on a single track. They were a network of arteries and veins, pulsing life across the landscape. This gradient model explains the conflicting evidence. The strontium isotopes from Alberta showing local residents. Those came from populations in the middle latitudes, where herds moved only 80 or 100 kilometers. The bone histology from Alaska showing overwintering. Those came from the northernmost populations adapted to polar darkness. The trackways stretching for over 1,000 kilometers. Those were the cumulative effect of the transitional populations, whose seasonal pulses were so consistent over millions of years that they wore literal grooves into the rock. And the bone beds at river crossings with mass casualties, those were the choke points where the migrating populations converged, their numbers creating exactly the kind of panic, trampling, and predation that the fossil record preserves. Everything fits. Once you accept that Edmontosaurus was not a single species with a single behavior, but a highly adaptable, geographically variable megaherbivore that solved the problem of survival in multiple different ways across its vast range. This is not a retreat from the epic migration story. It is an expansion of it into something richer and more realistic. The hadrosaurs were not following a script. They were writing one, in real time, in response to a changing world. And they wrote it for over 10 million years. To appreciate how remarkable this is, consider what a gradient migration strategy requires in terms of social coordination. A single herd does not simply decide to migrate 1,000 kilometers one year and 80 the next. The strategy is driven by environmental cues, but it is inherited. Herds that stayed in the north and overwintered had to teach their calves how to survive 4 months of darkness, how to conserve energy, how to recognize the subtle signs of early spring when the first thaw exposed patches of moss and dry grass. Herds that migrated long distances had to teach their calves the route, the timing, the river crossings, and the signals that coordinated departure. This knowledge was not instinctive. It was learned, preserved, and passed down through generations of matriarchs. The hadrosaurs had culture, not in the human sense, but in the deep biological sense of behaviors that persist across lifetimes and shape the survival of entire populations. Evidence for this cultural transmission comes from the trackways at one remarkable site in Alberta, where the same migration route was used for tens of thousands of years. The footprints are not randomly oriented. They follow exactly the same path, year after year, with younger tracks superimposed on older ones. But the fascinating detail is that the path occasionally shifted, not randomly, but in response to environmental changes that we can read in the sediment record. When a river changed course, the trackway shifted with it. When a lake dried up, the trackway diverted to a new water source. And when the landscape was flooded by a rising sea level, the trackway moved to higher ground. These shifts happened gradually, over generations, suggesting that each cohort of matriarchs learned the new route from their predecessors, adjusting but never starting from scratch. The migration was a living, evolving thing, a behavior that adapted as the world changed around it. And the world did change. The Cretaceous was not a static paradise. The western interior seaway, that great shallow sea that split the continent and defined the migration corridor, was in constant motion. Over millions of years it advanced and retreated, flooding thousands of square kilometers and then draining away again, driven by tectonic activity and global sea level fluctuations. Each time the seaway expanded, It squeezed the coastal plain into a narrower and narrower strip. The herds were forced closer together, their territories compressed, their migration routes truncated or blocked entirely. Each time the seaway retreated, it opened vast new areas of fertile lowland, and the herds expanded into them, exploring new routes, establishing new traditions. There is a haunting record of this process in the rocks of the Mancos Shale, a formation that represents a period of maximum marine flooding around 85 million years ago. During that time, the seaway covered most of what is now the Great Plains. The hadrosaurs were pushed into a thin ribbon of land along the western shore, a corridor perhaps only 100 kilometers wide in places. The population density must have been staggering. The trackways from this period show evidence of heavy trampling, overgrazing, and what paleontologists interpret as nutritional stress. The animals were surviving, but they were not thriving. And then, around 70 million years ago, the seaway began its final retreat. The plain opened up again, and the herds exploded in numbers and range, expanding into the newly exposed land, establishing the diverse migration patterns that would characterize the final few million years of their existence. But the most astonishing adaptation of all was yet to come, because the hadrosaurs did not just respond to the seaway. They may have helped create the very landscape that sustained them. The dust signature in the lake beds is not just a record of their passage. It is a record of their ecological impact. The trampling and grazing of millions of large herbivores broke down plant material, mixed it with mineral soil, and accelerated the nutrient cycle. Their dung, deposited across thousands of kilometers, fertilized the ground and stimulated new growth. The dust they raised was rich in phosphorus, iron, and organic matter, nutrients that, when deposited in distant lakes and coastal waters, fueled blooms of algae that formed the base of the food web. In effect, the hadrosaur migration was a planetary-scale nutrient pump, moving resources from the productive lowlands to the oceans, from the soil to the atmosphere, from the living to the dead and back again. A study published just last year in the journal Geology measured the concentration of phosphorus in the dust layers attributed to hadrosaur activity and found it to be 10 times higher than background levels. The phosphorus was bound to clay particles that had passed through hadrosaur digestive tracts, as evidenced by the presence of diagnostic phytoliths, microscopic silica bodies from plants that were fractured and etched in ways characteristic of chewing and digestion. These tiny particles, carried aloft in the dust and deposited in the stagnant waters of the inland seaway, would have triggered massive algal blooms. Those blooms, in turn, would have died and sunk to the seafloor, creating vast organic rich shales that are today some of the most important oil source rocks in North America. The hadrosaurs, in their seasonal pulses of movement, were fueling not just the ecosystem of their own time, but the energy reserves of our modern civilization. The oil that powers your car may have begun, in some small part, as the dust kicked up by a migrating herd of duck-billed dinosaurs 68 million years ago. This is not hyperbole. It is the emerging consensus from a new field of research that combines isotope, geochemistry, sedimentology, and dinosaur paleontology to understand the deep time impacts of large herbivore migrations. And it has profound implications for how we understand the end of the dinosaurs. Because if the hadrosaurs were a keystone species, a group whose movements pumped nutrients across an entire continent and shaped the chemistry of the oceans, then their extinction would have been more than just the loss of a few large animals. It would have been the collapse of the system. The Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, the asteroid impact that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago, is famous for its immediate effects: the fireball, the darkness, the global cooling. But the long-term ecological consequences, the slow unraveling of the ecosystems that the dinosaurs had built and sustained for over 100 million years, are only now beginning to be understood. Imagine the impact winter. For months or even years after the asteroid struck, sunlight was reduced to a dim twilight. Plants could not photosynthesize. The forests died. The great fern prairies withered. The hadrosaurs, whether migratory or resident, whether adapted to polar darkness or not, all faced the same crisis. There was nothing to eat. The dust they had once raised now settled in a silent shroud over a starving world. The river crossings where they had gathered each year were quiet. The trackways, maintained by generation after generation of matriarchs, grew over with the first pioneering mosses and ferns that recolonized the devastated landscape. Within perhaps 1,000 years, not a single hadrosaur remained anywhere on Earth. But here is the final, surprising detail. In the last few decades, paleontologists have discovered something strange in the very uppermost layers of the Cretaceous, just before the extinction boundary. The trackways seem to change. The dust pulses in the lake beds weaken. The bone beds from river crossings become smaller and less frequent. It is as if the migration itself was breaking down, the herds shrinking, the routes fragmenting, the great circulatory system of the continent losing pressure. Was this a sign of environmental stress even before the asteroid? A gradual decline that the impact merely finished? Or was it an illusion, a sampling artifact, a gap in the record that we misinterpret as a trend? The debate is ongoing, and it cuts to the heart of how we understand mass extinctions. Were the dinosaurs already doomed, the asteroid just the final push? Or were they thriving, their world vibrant and complete, until a single catastrophic day erased it all? The hadrosaurs cannot answer. Their bones are silent. Their dust is stone. But the gradient migration model, the picture of a species that was supremely adaptable, suggests that they were not fragile. They had survived the advance and retreat of the seaway, the rise and fall of mountain ranges, the pushing and pulling of a planet in constant flux. Their diversity of movement strategies was an insurance policy against change. If one population failed, another could recolonize. If a migration route was blocked, a new one could be learned. This was a system that had endured for 10 million years. It is hard to believe that it simply ran out of steam on the eve of the asteroid. More likely, it was cut down in its prime, a living tapestry of movement and memory and communication, all of it silenced in an instant of cosmic violence. And yet, the story does not end there, because the pattern the hadrosaurs perfected, the gradient migration, the networked metapopulation, the seasonal pulse of large herbivores across a seasonal landscape, did not die with them. It re-evolved again and again in the mammals that inherited their world. The woolly mammoths of the Ice Age, the bison of the Great Plains, the caribou of the Arctic, and the wildebeest of the Serengeti all follow the same fundamental strategy that the Edmontosaurus pioneered. The dust they raise still fertilizes the oceans. The trails they wear still groove the earth. The matriarchs still lead, the calves still follow, and the river crossings still kill. The hadrosaurs were the first, and in many ways the greatest, of the great migrators. And the world they shaped, the pulse of life across a continent, is still beating today. The dust of their passage may be stone, but the rhythm of their journey has never stopped. Every year, on the Serengeti Plain, something stirs that would feel achingly familiar to a time traveler from the Cretaceous. The wildebeest herds assemble, not randomly, but in age-segmented columns, the calves at the center, the experienced females at the front. They cross rivers thick with crocodiles. They navigate routes that have been learned over generations. Their hooves raise dust that fertilizes distant lakes. And when the matriarchs pause at the water's edge, testing the air for danger, they are reenacting a ritual that dinosaurs perfected 68 million years before the first wildebeest was born. The migration is not a behavior that evolved once. It is a shape that life keeps reaching toward, a solution to the problem of seasons that works so well that evolution has discovered it over and over, across epochs, across extinctions, across the rise and fall of entirely different worlds. This is the deeper story of the hadrosaurs. Yes, we can argue about the distance. We can ask whether they traveled 2,600 kilometers or 100. We can debate isotopes and bone histology and dust pulses in ancient lake beds. These debates matter because they sharpen our understanding of how life actually works on a planet that does not stand still. But the argument about distance misses the point. The miracle is not how far they walked. The miracle is that they walked together with purpose, with memory, with a social structure that allowed thousands of individuals to coordinate movement across a landscape full of predators and obstacles. That capability, more than any single number of kilometers, is what made them successful, and it is what connects them to every migratory animal that has ever lived. The same things that would have killed an Edmontosaurus on its journey are still killing wildebeest today. A river crossing, a moment of panic, a calf separated from its mother, and the crocodiles are waiting. The dust that the hadrosaurs lifted into the Cretaceous sky is the same dust that rises over the Serengeti every spring and settles, eventually, into the Indian Ocean, where it feeds the algae that feed the fish that feed the people who live along that coast. The global nutrient pump that the dinosaurs operated has not stopped. It has just changed hands. Mammals, birds, and even insects now do the work that was once done by herds of duckbills that blackened the horizon from Alaska to Mexico. We are living in the world they built, running on rhythms they established. The extinction that took them did not take the pattern. The pattern endures. And it endures because it is older than dinosaurs. Before the hadrosaurs, there were other migrators. Before the Cretaceous, back in the Triassic, early dinosaurs and their relatives were already moving seasonally across the supercontinent of Pangaea. The trackways that crisscross the ancient dune fields of the American Southwest are evidence that migration is not a Cretaceous invention. It is a Triassic one, or earlier still. It is a fundamental strategy for life on a planet with seasons. The hadrosaurs simply elevated it, scaled it up, turned it into a continent-spanning system of pulses and flows that shaped the chemistry of the oceans and the atmosphere. They were the most accomplished practitioners of a very ancient art. But there is a final piece of the legacy that is even stranger, and it has to do with what the hadrosaurs left inside us. Not in our genes, not in some direct evolutionary inheritance, but in the way we understand time. When we track the seasons, when we mark the return of the birds or the blooming of the first flowers, we are performing a version of what the hadrosaur matriarch did when she lifted her head and sampled the wind and knew that the time had come to move. Humans are migrants too. Our ancestors followed the herds across the Ice Age steppes. Our cities pulse with seasonal rhythms of travel and return. We are a species that moves, and our fascination with migration in other animals is not just scientific curiosity. It is recognition. We see ourselves in the wildebeest, in the caribou, in the monarch butterfly. And now, if we look closely enough, we can see ourselves in the hadrosaurs too. That recognition can be a quiet thing. It doesn't require a lesson or a message. It just requires you to sit with the image of a herd moving across an open plain at sunset, the dust golden in the last light, the calls echoing across the distance, the calves safe at the center, the matriarch steady at the front. That image is not imaginary. It happened. It happened for millions of years, in a world that was as real and solid and present as the one outside your window tonight. And the only reason you can't walk outside and see it is the astonishing cruelty of time and a single very bad day 66 million years ago. But you can still hear it if you listen. The deep rumble of infrasound, the vibration that traveled through the ground for kilometers, the call that kept the herd together through dust storms and darkness. That sound, or something very like it, still echoes in the communication of elephants, in the songs of whales, in the rhythmic thrum of a world that is always moving, always passing, always returning. The hadrosaurs are gone. Their bones are stone. Their tracks are fossils. But the rhythm they established, the pulse of life across a continent, hasn't missed a beat in 68 million years. And tonight, as you drift toward sleep, You are drifting into that rhythm, a rhythm older than the dinosaurs, a rhythm that will still be humming long after we are gone. Thanks for spending some time in the Cretaceous tonight. If you enjoyed this journey and want to drift off to more stories about ancient worlds, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really does help. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you. There's something quietly wonderful about knowing all the different places and moments where this same story is reaching someone. Now, close your eyes. Let your breathing slow, and know that you are part of a living world that has been migrating through time for billions of years. And somewhere, deep in the quiet, the dust of an ancient herd is still settling softly on a forgotten shore. Sleep well. You are home.